Imagine you always have a friend who's in crisis. Every time you talk to them, there's a new emergency or some sort of new problem. Every single time you talk to them, they always need something from you. Your money, your time, or your attention. They keep triangulating you into their unhappiness, trying to use you to gang up on whoever or whatever is the source of their unhappiness. They're constantly seeking for your validation and support, and feeding off your sympathy and agreement. At first, you help because you're compassionate. You care about them. But it always seems like they're never dealing with the root causes of their problems, and they're always trying to manage the symptoms of their problems. They never seem to be growing past these problems. And sadly, they never seem to take the part of accountability in their part of their story. Instead, they learn that if they continually describe their story with enough emotion, weak people or people with no boundaries will continue to provide support. Once they realize that you feel guilty for saying no, they can constantly use compassion as a lever against you. The kindness that you show today becomes the mechanism of control that they use against you in the future. In personal relationships, we can identify this a lot more easily than in other kinds of relationships. In fact, people looking at us as a third party will be able to identify this much sooner than we will ourselves. We have to come to terms that people who refuse to accept somebody else's boundaries isn't doing so out of love, they're doing so out of the idea of gaining control. In families, we call it dysfunctional. In a workplace, we call it manipulation. In a marriage, we may even consider that abusive, but in politics, somehow it remains in the realm of being called compassion. But a government without boundaries is not compassionate. And like the controlling leviathan that it becomes an all-consuming monster with an insatiable appetite for power. We don't recognize it immediately because the party names change. Whoever controls Leviathan we think is somehow different because the name of the person's throwing the lever and in control of the switches and the power is different. Politicians stop asking what are we morally permitted to do, and the narrative shifts to what can we get away with, what can we justify by declaring a need or crisis or emergency. And in true form to the Hegelian dialectic, people become so afraid of the boogeyman that they elect somebody with enough power to rescue them from their travesties. And once fear becomes the motivation to appoint authority, there is literally no limit to how much personal sovereignty the people are willing to abdicate. There is always another crisis, another emergency, another social inequality to solve. There is always the fear that an unhampered and unrestricted market will lead to failure. And there is always another leader of another country willing to upset our civil tranquility. Somehow government always finds a reason to step just a little bit further into our personal lives, into controlling private property, into curtailing freedom of speech and the right to contract. So freedom doesn't disappear in the dark. Instead, it disappears in the light, in plain view of everybody to see. James Madison said during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, there are more instances of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. This is the true story of the frog boiling in a pot of water. If you turn the temperature up too fast by having him sit on a pot in the stove, he simply jumps out. He recognizes the temperature is rising too rapidly. But turn this temperature up more slowly, and the frog doesn't jump out and eventually is cooked without even realizing it. Sometimes freedom disappears slowly under increased taxes or regulation. Sometimes it's under the guise of a law designed to create safety in society. Maybe it's an online harms act. Maybe it's a freedom of speech issue, or maybe it's a public health order. And for a brief moment, and if you're not thinking it through, these ideas for more control and power on a temporary basis sound generally appealing. A crisis emerges and people want to avoid suffering at any cost possible. And although some of these crises may be genuine, a lot of them may be exaggerated, manipulated, or deliberately manufactured. These crises produce fear, anxiety, and the demand for somebody to do something about it. Government then offers a solution that demands that everybody temporarily give up some of their dangerous freedoms in order to satisfy the fear. Simply put, a crisis emerges, people have fear, and then people consent to greater state power. And if you object to the conclusion that greater state power is inevitable or necessary, then somehow you are the problem. If you consider the logical and moral reasoning behind the consent of greater power, then it all boils down to emotional pressure. And emotional pressure is rooted in our biological wiring of tribalism. If you disagree with the rest of the people in your cave, way back in our history, then that would almost mean certain death. We couldn't share the resources in order to successfully hunt, and therefore starvation was inevitable. And of course, real suffering is not to be dismissed. But we need to ask ourselves the question on whether the avoidance of such suffering is reasonable justification for increased state power. It's not just crises. What about every inequality, every inconvenience? Should these become the responsibility of the state to solve? Because if every problem becomes the government's responsibility to solve, then every government solution eventually becomes your own responsibility. It becomes your inflation burden. It becomes your tax increase. It's an increase to the compliance and regulation regime. It gets twisted into saying your privacy wouldn't matter if you had nothing to hide. And finally, your freedom is selfish. The state assigns the need and then assigns you the burden of the price. And if you as a citizen were to object, then somehow it's not an objection of the solution. Somehow you become discompassionate. For example, suggesting that people don't care about the poor if they were to mention the word austerity in government policy. This is not new, of course. Political philosophers have been warning us about these usurpations and the consent to power over the last many centuries. In his 1266 work De Regno, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that the government of the kingdom must be so arranged that opportunity to tyrannize is removed. He was issuing a warning about unlimited power. A good ruler may respect limits voluntarily, but a bad ruler must be restrained by the law. And because no society can always guarantee that virtuous people will hold office, the political order must be built so tyranny is prevented before it becomes obvious. The apparatus of power must be so constructed that every law must be measured by the potential abuse by somebody who is a sociopath or a tyrant who may come into power in the future. A great example of this is when the Bolshevik Revolution installed the socialist utopia. Now, let's be honest, the socialist utopia wasn't very people-forward to begin with. But in the hands of Stalin, it created mass murder. And that's a sidebar to describe the ultimate danger of socialism and communism. In order to effect enough economic control, personal freedoms must also be extinguished in the exact same manner. And that amount of power in the even right hands, but definitely the wrong hands, will lead to catastrophe and mass murder. Pol Pot in Cambodia, Stalin in Russia, Mao Zedong in China. All these men had to eliminate opposition to the switch to the communist regime. The danger with power is not that bad people may get into power, but rather that power creates the opportunity to abuse itself. The immature voter will believe that everything will be fine if the right people get in. But the smart person says to himself, what happens when these powers get into the wrong hands? What happens when a benevolent ruler is switched out in the future for a malevolent ruler? What happens if emergencies become perpetual and set a new standard for control? Eventually, erosion of legal objectivity leads to law justifying the usurpation of power instead of working to restrain it. Whenever power is restrained, it becomes the new standard for personal and economic freedom. These two go hand in hand. You cannot have economic without personal freedom, and you cannot have personal freedom without economic freedom. Because no society can guarantee that only a virtuous person may hold office, the office itself must be limited. Actions such as executive orders in the USA or orders in council in Canada are abhorrent to the democratic process. Sir John Fortescue, writing in his book de laudibus legum Angliae, referred to Aquinas' anti-tyranny argument and brought it forward into the English common law tradition. A king of England cannot, at his pleasure, make any alterations in the laws of the land. He argued that a king is not free to tyrannize where sovereign power is restrained by political laws, and that in England, unlike a merely regal monarchy, the king could not alter the laws at their pleasure, not by the trust or the mood of the people, or by campaign promises or the personality of the person holding office. The royal and the politician must both be constrained by the objectivity of law. If government and those who control it can define its own boundaries, then it has no boundaries. If the state can reinterpret any limit placed upon it, exempt itself from every restraint, or pass a law that yesterday would have been considered unconstitutional, then the citizen is not governed by law, it is governed by the sheer will of the person who sits on the throne of power. And once law becomes subservient to power, rights become permissions. And those permissions can be granted or revoked by someone's ultimate will and discretion. In his work Common Sense, Thomas Paine outlines something that politicians constantly try to blur: that society and government are not the same thing. Society is where humans actually live and build families and businesses, where associations and communities and a close association of values bind people together. Government, on the other hand, is where people use power to compel others. We should remember that government isn't totally irrelevant. It does have a necessary role. Paine himself called government a necessary evil, and an evil even in its best state. What is necessary, however, shouldn't be misconstrued as being omniscient or omnipresent, and it shouldn't mean that society will be totally absorbed by the will of the state. Government must be at least limitedly necessary because human beings are flawed, and flaws lead to conflicts, and rules are used to resolve such conflicts. But it also means that human beings are flawed, and governments are run by people, so government must be limited. It's not run by some infallible Superman. Where Paine told us not to confuse society and government, Montesquieu described how to stop government from completely swallowing up society. He understood that liberty cannot survive where power is concentrated, and he wrote a simple but powerful statement: power must check power. Power isn't checked by campaign slogans or press conferences. And power is certainly not checked by convincing society that all the experts have agreed on an issue. Every single part of the structure of the state must meet resistance in the law itself. This means that the legal system must be non-partisan and independent. Emergency powers should always be rigorously and necessarily debated. Every restriction on an individual's right to commerce or speech must be questioned. Power doesn't merely expand because it arrives as a tyrant. Power expands because that's what power does. I honestly believe that the people in government believe that the ends justify the means. They just don't correlate or understand the facts that the amount of power needed to solve necessity or inequality brings unimaginable horrors. Montesquieu's concern was that even altruistic power needs limits, especially powers designed to create equal outcomes that are branded as compassion. Because once coercion is branded as compassion, any limitation of government expansion of power seems cruel and unjustified. Alongside Montesquieu, James Madison puts something in here that we need to remember, and that is human nature. Madison did not build constitutional theory around imaginary saints or assume that ambitious people would want to avoid power. In fact, he was wise enough to know that people seek power, expand power, defend power, and rationalize power. That is why he wrote that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, and if angels governed men, no controls on government would be necessary. But no one is an angel. Not politicians or regulators or activists or lobbyists. Not the central bankers or the police or the public health officials or the economists. Nobody is. Not the people you oppose and not the people you support. Now, most people discover the importance of limited government when their enemies are in power, but only wishing for limited power when the people that are against you have that power That is not a principled standard, that is a tactic. If you only believe in free speech when your speech is being censored, but on the other hand don't feel that people should have the right to say something offensive, then you do not believe in free speech. If you only believe in limits on emergency powers when your actions are being restricted, but you don't want other people to take certain actions and have that restricted under law, you do not believe in freedom of movement. If you believe in restraining the powers of government only when your political opponent holds it, you do not believe in restrained government. You believe in your favored party and politician holding power and wielding that power to instill your values. Madison's argument cuts through it all. The society does not design government for angels. It designs government for sinners. Lord Acton famously added that if power corrupts, then absolute power corrupts absolutely. Acton was not only suggesting that bad people do bad things when they gain authority, he was saying that authority itself creates the moral danger. A title is not a purification ceremony, and the office doesn't sanctify the office holder. A democratic mandate does not make every action moral just because whoever had authority made it. A majority vote doesn't magically turn coercion into virtue. That's why the rule of law must restrain the person before the person starts redefining the law. John Locke adds something else in this recipe that we're cooking. For Locke, government exists to protect the life, liberty, and property, but not to create it. Modern politics acts contrary to Locke's principle of natural law and too often treats property as if it exists by permission. Your income is what remains after taking a slice off the top by taxes from the state. Your business operates under layers of regulation. Your land may be in your name, but your use of it may be trapped under layers of zoning, permitting, and environmental discretion. Your savings are exposed to the dilution of monetary policy over time. Your freedom of speech or conscience may be codified under their Charter of Rights, but only until the government starts drawing circles of unacceptable speech, hateful speech, or harmful speech. Locke knew that the government is not the source of your rights. Government is supposed to be the protector of the rights already pre-established to you. Because if government is the one to establish your rights, then government has the power to revoke them at their discretion. And if government exists to protect the rights it did not create, then government must be judged by a higher standard than its own voracious appetite for power. And here's where Frédéric Bastiat takes Locke's argument and raises it to a whole nother level. Bastiat argued that the law becomes corrupted when it does the very thing it was created to prevent. He called this legal plunder, which is what happens when the law is used to take from some people for the benefit of others. It's what happens when political force is used to do what private citizens could never be allowed to do on their own. If I take your property by force on my own, I should not be able to vote for someone else to take it for me. If I cannot censor you personally, I should not be able to use democracy to create laws to silence you. Bastiat's position exposed the moral laundering of political acts that would be condemned if done privately, that are praised when they are done publicly. Law is not supposed to legalize theft when it is supposed to prevent it. Whenever law becomes the instrument of plunder, the citizen is trapped, because the very thing that is supposed to be protecting him becomes the thing that he needs protection from. Alexis de Tocqueville saw another angle to this. He understood that democratic despotism might not look like old tyranny. It may arrive feeling gentle, administrative, and helpful. He warned us against a soft kind of despotism, where citizens remain outwardly free but are gradually reduced to dependence under immense protective power. It's a chilling image because it's not a place where citizens are obviously brutally oppressed. It describes a society where citizens are managed and are okay with it. In fact, they ask for it. The greatest danger is not that we lose our tyranny in an overnight revolution, but rather by 1,000 cuts to new laws, new regulations, and new taxes. Before you know it, you need a license, permission, or permit to do everything that you were able to do yesterday for nothing. No single rule or law will feel like slavery, but they create a society where people still work and think that they're free, while more and more of their life is secretly moved under administrative supervision. And this is the danger of soft despotism. It feels cozy or warm or some inevitable result of the progress of democracy. But F.A. Hayek suggested that power simply isn't altruistic because it is installed through democracy. Arbitrary power shouldn't be defended on the basis of its origins. A law can still be passed democratically and still violate liberty. A regulation can go through the proper procedure and still feel arbitrary or abusive. A government program can have compassion branding and still create dependency, waste, surveillance, or coercion. And people born into a system where soft despotism exists, such as Canada in the last 50, 60, 70 years, think that any changes are a natural progression of the order. They suggest that we live in a democracy and any expansion of power would not harm that democracy. But they are mistaken because their presentism blinds them from objectivity. They only view their opinions and ideas through the lens of anecdotal evidence and don't consider the bigger or historical picture. Imagine being born halfway going down a slide. Going down the rest of the slide may be weird to the person who's sitting and objectively watching a childbirth on a slide on the playground. You don't recognize the danger when you're in it. Hayek's perspective is the modern evolution of the thinkers of Aquinas, Locke, Bastiat, de Tocqueville, Madison, and others. Across the centuries, they're all saying the same thing in history. Power must be limited because power is dangerous even when it claims to be good. Another political philosopher that we must consider is Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan. Hobbes looked at fear, disorder, and violence, insecurity, and civil conflict, and argued that without a strong authority capable of enforcing peace, society can descend into chaos. The state and the power of it should not be dismissed on the basis of mistrust of the state alone, because order, law, and civil peace are important. A society unable to enforce peace becomes unstable. Hobbes argued that the agreements without the sword remain mere words. But once you create the sword in order to enforce the peace, who restrains the government? Who restrains the sword wielder? Who limits the authority to protect the people? Who governs the government? The same state that says it needs power to preserve control can use it to quash dissent. Government that says it needs to instill the Emergency Powers Act in order to handle a crisis soon realizes that every political problem becomes an emergency. Financial controls today to stop crime could become financial controls tomorrow to punish disobedience. Speech regulation to prevent people from harm can be used tomorrow by the state to prevent criticism against itself. Hobbes reminded us that government needs to exist, but it needs to be restrained. And its mere existence is why boundaries matter. And it's here where we bring forward psychological thinkers in order to give a voice and a power to people thinking and reflecting back to these political thinkers. In their book Boundaries, Henry Cloud and John Townsend explain that boundaries define what is me and what is not me. In personal relationships, a boundary clarifies ownership. It tells us what I'm responsible for and what I am not responsible for. It's as much a personal principle as it is a political one. In a dysfunctional relationship, the person without boundaries says, your crisis is automatically my responsibility. Your feelings automatically control my choices. Your poor planning automatically becomes my sacrifice. And your emergency automatically becomes my obligation. In politics, the boundaryless citizen is trained to say, every social problem is automatically government's responsibility. And if every social problem is automatically government's responsibility, then every social problem automatically becomes the citizen's responsibility. It's the citizen's responsibility to pay punitive taxes. It's the citizen's responsibility to bear the burden of inflation, even though inflation's issue comes from monetary and fiscal policy. Municipalities create restrictive housing zoning rules and permit rules, and people suffer from a housing shortage. The state creates dependency and then calls that dependency compassion. Politicians interfere in the free market and then call the free market dysfunctional. And whenever the citizen says enough, The state says, "How dare you?" These are all violations of a healthy relationship. And Canadians need to realize this comes from a non-partisan position. There is nothing more absurd than believing government is only evil when the opposing party holds power. It's philosophically lazy, on the other hand, to believe that every law is immediately tyrannical. The point here is that the expansion of the state needs limits. Every increase to state power must face vigorous opposition, and every reason for expansion needs to have its own burden of proof of its necessity. Because government is the only institution in society that acts by force. Churches and charities ask, and the entrepreneur serves, but the government compels. And because government compels, it must be limited. It's not up to the people, the society, to give a burden of proof of why they need freedom. The state needs to provide its burden of proof on the expansion of its authority. Simply put, the burden of power rests on power, not on liberty. And that is the case against unlimited government. The thinkers and philosophers we've explored today have given historical and philosophical reasons why government must be limited. Because a government without boundaries becomes a relationship that's dysfunctional. It becomes that person in the relationship who never learns, never sets any boundaries. It's the entity that never accepts responsibility for its behavior. It never limits its demands and treats every no as a moral failure. Despite the political clamoring to the contrary, freedom cannot ever be protected by trusting power. It can only be protected by limiting it. And this is true not just when your enemies hold office, but when your friends hold office, because we tend to be more sympathetic to power when it's more friendly. A free citizen must be able to say no to the state, and one who cannot dissent is not free. And when enough people are unafraid to say that I am no longer collateral for your ideology, that my conscience and my mind are my sovereign property, and my speech should not be constricted or changed to soothe your emotions, maybe we can put Canada back on track to remember that we are a country under the rule of law and the supremacy of God, which names common and natural law as the rules of order. Maybe we will remember that government is a servant to, not the master of, the people. And maybe we'll remember that no ruler should be trusted with unlimited power. Otherwise, your dissension to the state is unprincipled and only a tactic to install the regime you like. And if freedoms apply equally to all people, then it also needs to apply right across the political spectrum. And if we don't remember these things, we're simply going to elect a new dictator every election cycle. Because as Thomas Paine said, strength and fear consist wholly in resisting them. If you found this video to be helpful in your journey of discovery in financial literacy, history, philosophy, politics, and economics, make sure you hit a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for upcoming videos.